Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Secure Code Warrior. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. Before we begin today, I have just a few housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch at a later date, today's recording will be available shortly after we conclude the webinar today. The Q&A tab on the right side of your screen is where we want you to go ahead and send in any questions you might have for our speakers today. And if you have any other concerns or comments to make, I want you to direct those to the chat tab. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around. So our topic today is best practices for secure development in 2022. And I'm joined today by Junie Dinda, CMO at Secure Code Warrior, who will introduce the rest of our panel and lead the rest of our discussion today. Junie, thank you so much for being here with us.
All right. I am super excited today. So welcome and thank you for joining us for the webinar today on the topic of increasing software release velocity with holistic developer-driven security. So my name is Junie Dinda. I'm the CMO at Secure Code Warrior, and I'm joined today by our CTO, Matthias Badu, and our guest panelist, Julie Tsai, a cybersecurity leader and SecDevOps veteran, and Darko Meszaros, a senior developer advocate from AWS. So thank you all for joining us today. So I'm really excited to get going on this because we met about a week ago and we were just having a lot of discussions on things that we were going to cover today. And we ran over time and are very passionate about all of the answers to all of the questions. So I really think this is going to be a very interesting discussion on all of the challenges that are facing developer teams. So now if the audience has any questions during our discussion, please feel free to drop them into the chat in the Q&A function of the platform. And we're going to get to them at the end of the section. So Q&A, it's just up there. Please do drop them in. Don't be shy. And we hope to get to all of them. All right. So before we get started, Julie and Darko, can I ask you just to briefly introduce yourself and your backgrounds? Julie, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm a cybersecurity and infrastructure DevOps veteran. I've worked in Silicon Valley companies for about the past 25 years or so. Great variety. I like to stay on my toes, so I go back and forth between very small companies, and have also spent about 3 years over at Walmart e-commerce, and most recently was head of cybersecurity for Roblox, which would have been the second company that I had worked with through their direct public offering.
Excellent. Thank you.
Darko. And me, yes, I guess. My name is Darko. I'm what they used to call a system administrator. That's what I used to work a long time ago. I used to be the guy who would carry around a screwdriver and set up servers. I transitioned to the world of the cloud. So now I get to talk to the wonderful developers, the builders, the folks out there who do magic stuff in the cloud. And I get to talk to you about the best practices, how things should have been done. I'm here to listen to you about what's good and what's bad about AWS. And I happen to work for AWS as a developer advocate.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. So I'm going to get us started. So Matthias, I'm going to start with you. Opening question. So despite all of the security measures that organizations have in place, we're still seeing the repercussions of exploitable like software vulnerabilities. So if I think back to the past couple of months, the Log4j caused huge problems and waves throughout the industry and throughout companies. So with all of the tools and technologies that are being used today, the question is, so why do these vulnerabilities still exist?
Well, the fact of the matter, everything that you've mentioned right now is technology. And it seems to be that, we think that we can fix technology with more technology. One thing that we kind of forget is that behind the technology, there's people. There's people that need to install these systems, need to create these systems, need to essentially build the software. And I'm a strong believer that there needs to be a really good balance of making sure the technology is right, but also making sure that the people that use and create the technology are essentially skilled people, and they have the right skill set to deploy all this. So for me, the reason why is I think it needs a healthy balance between the right people with the right technology, creating the right things. That is my strong belief.
Got it. That makes sense. Julie, do you agree with this? And so where do you think organizations also struggle kind of with this balance?
Yeah, 1000% I agree with Matthias on this. At the end of the day, we tend to forget this sometimes because technology at a certain stage starts to look like magic, right? But at some point, someone built it. Someone needs to maintain it. Something needs to be constantly bringing back in new knowledge. And where we've kind of outsmarted ourselves is that as you layer on more technology, you now have more things you need to manage. You need a greater level of sophistication and complexity management, or things have to be very, very dialed in from the beginning, and people have to understand why. So I think it's really important for people to, us as practitioners as well as consumers of the technology, to understand that technology does all these wonderful things to facilitate our lives and make things possible that weren't before. But at the same time, there's never a moment where you get to abdicate your understanding or your maintenance of what's going on. You always have to be paying attention. You need to be working with good, responsible people around you. You need to be, really engaging in the policies and processes. Like over-indexing on only one of those components, that technology or process or people, just means that you're going to end up having some sort of bottleneck somewhere else if it's not moving in concert.
Interesting. And then Darko, I would also love to get your take on it as far as you hear, how are developers specifically faring as it comes to ensuring that software is free of these vulnerabilities?
So let me take a step back. When I was a younger Darko, I used to be this thing, maintaining systems, setting up servers. And when I used to do something bad, the security team would come and get me. They would be like, why did you use bash? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? I didn't have to care about those things because somebody would ultimately yell at me if I did something wrong. One of the things that has changed in this modern landscape of the cloud, of everything being very API driven, is that security is everybody's job. You cannot be a system administrator or a DevOps engineer, whatever you like to call them, without being involved in security. Every aspect of the system you build needs to be security focused. This goes for developers, this goes for builders, this goes for engineers, for network people. So one of the things that I've seen has changed is that security has become a part of your entire developer adventure, right? You're no longer I'm just going to write code. No, you're going to write secure code because that's of your interest. So that's some of the things that I've seen have changed. And developers are more now understanding some additional security elements like network security, ACLs, security groups, firewalls, those kind of things.
Yeah, I want to plus one to Darko's point that as we've seen the automation empower groups to basically do a lot of their own deployment, there's been tremendous pressure, of course, to allow open and quick deployment of technologies by developers of all across the spectrum of the enterprise and at every skill level, right? I think the part that has to catch up here is, are we building in the tooling for people to make good choices along the way and enforcing that all along the way? And that's the part that needs to be brought back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
The tooling and the enforcement.
That's right.
And so Matthias, from a beyond the balance perspective, so as you see the biggest threat that that organizations have to contend with as it comes to software security.
The biggest threat that organizations have to contend with. So for me, I still think it's making sure that you are able to employ the right people. Quite often, you have a lot of churn and new people come in. Ultimately, it cannot be the case that the next bunch of people that come in only have to do bug fixes and only need to do or pick up the slack from the previous people. Otherwise, they're going to move on again. So ultimately, for me, I think the biggest threat to application security is the constant churn of people and people coming in and not doing the right thing. And essentially, by the way, I really liked Julie's point of building technology on top of technology. We tried that 10 years ago with firewalls. We've built broken systems and we said, hey, you know what? It's broken. Let's build something on top of the broken system to fix actually the broken system. And, fix the broken system, make sure that there's an inherent problem here. You will never get out of the rat race if you build on top of broken systems. And that's just a consequence of, those people moved on. We do not know what it was and how to fix it. So we need to put a layer on top of it. By the way, I'm a big fan of layered security. Don't get me wrong, but that was the wrong way of doing layered security. So for me, it's making sure that you build something which developers are essentially proud of, but also can last a long, long time. And that the next bunch of developers that come on board can say, well, I enjoy this technology and I want to be part of the team and I want to keep on building on top of it. And I think that is a major threat to a lot of organizations where they just build broken stuff on top of broken stuff, and nobody sees a way out of fixing the initial part of the development.
So it's almost like having like that longer term strategy of how are we gonna build a sustainable program and processes kind of in place. Okay, interesting. And so Julie, sorry.
No, I was going to say I agree. Otherwise, you're just going to burn through people over and over again, and it's never going to stop.
Right.
No, I think that's interesting. And then, I think as we think though, about organizations and then prioritizing security in their development processes, do you think that organizations are doing that on the whole? Julia, I would just love to get your take on that. And if they are, I think I understand why. But if they're not, then why aren't they?
Yeah, thinking about, I think it honestly comes back to having a commitment to integrity and quality and robustness. Some of the things that Matthias was talking about, what's making it a joyful experience to work somewhere, as opposed to something that feels painful and drudgery. And hey, when can I go get my next job, right? These things kind of go together in terms of not just the velocity of being able to put in changes, but also the quality level of the infrastructure and the code that you're stepping into. Are you going to be able to build and do something really great and proficient, or are you just going to be doing something that feels like janitorial, or like you're plugging your fingers into the dam, before we speak? And I think, Junie, it really comes back to some very fundamental trade-offs between short and long-term impulses, right? The longer-term quality impulses to build with integrity and robustness, it's always going to get challenged by speed to market and minimum viable product. And so the wise and nimble organization makes those trade-offs very, very carefully. Not every single choice all the time should be just, quick and dirty, but yet at the same time, not every time is it the choice towards we're going to always defer everything for 2 to 3 years and just do it straight from the bottom up. There has to be a very wise and nuanced selection of, hey, this is the trade-off we're going to make right now to be quick, and here's the one where we cannot afford to give away because we will never get that back.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's an excellent point, because you want to be nimble, you want to be agile, you want to be elastic. I worked in projects would take 2 years to complete. That was 10 years ago. It would be insane if somebody told me oh, we're going to do this in 2 years. What? Am I going to be working here in 2 years? I don't know. So it is very important to be kind of agile, but at the same time, introduce some security best practices as well. So it's a fine balance to have.
Maybe one thing to add here is I do see a lot of projects missing that point, in the sense that quite often at the start of the project, you try to find product market fit. You do not think about security. Yeah. Let's be honest, you do not think about security or quality or speed or whatever. You just want to find product market fit. And once that takes off, then you actually quickly need to, come around and make sure it gets secured, it gets reliable. And the most notable example for me was Twitter way back in the day. How much security do you need for, 160 characters or 140 characters back in the day? Very little, right? And then suddenly it took off, and there were, it was taken down constantly because they missed actually that point where, they became popular and they were not able to transition fast enough from a proof of concept into a real world production system. Yeah. So it's the nature of how we also how economics work. First, you need to find product market fit, but then quite quickly you need to make sure that, hey, you have to come around. You have to make sure people, processes are in place to build the thing securely.
Yeah.
And then in, I guess, making the trade-offs and then figuring out the focus and the target and the trade-offs, how visible is this communicated in the organization, and how important is it to communicate in the organization as well to kind of get that buy-off and get that kind of culture?
I would say that it requires some level of trust, right? Enforcing some of these trade-offs can be very finicky because these trade-offs and these balances are very fuzzy, right? It's difficult to define a document. You will only spend 27% of time on secure code, while the rest you can experiment, right? There needs to be a significant amount of trust to the developer saying like, yes, I pay you and I trust you to build secure code. Here are some guidelines, here are some tools, here's all of these things that can help you write code fast and secure.
Yeah. And I would say that trust has to go two-way. And this is where, you get into cultural things that are hard to, it when it's broken, but it's hard to like put it back once it's gone. People have to believe in the wisdom and the intentions of the leadership enough to think that, hey, they're giving me the right goalposts. They're telling me to trade off on this thing. I may or may not disagree, but I'm going to dissent and commit. So it has to be a two-way trust on respect for like, what each party is bringing to the table. And more than once, I've worked with engineers, like extremely talented, brilliant people. And, I'd have to say something, look, 5 years or 10 years ago, I would be saying exactly the same thing you are right now. Right now, we're going to make a trade-off. And I promise you, we'll come back and get it later, but it's tough because you have to trust everybody's capability to navigate that.
Maybe one thing to add next to trust is I do see that there needs to be mutual interest, meaning if developers want to do the right thing and are not given the time to do the right thing, it's not going to happen.
It's
and
empty.
The other way around as well, from a managerial perspective, you really need to believe in, hey, we want to build secure software and we want to, be not necessarily a front runner, but we want to make sure that we're at least in the pack, and we're not lagging in this entire ecosystem. So for me, it's mutual responsibility. Developers need to have the mindset of, hey, we want to build something secure, but also from a managerial perspective, they need to say, you know what, we want to do the right thing. And by the way, you are given time to upskill yourself and make sure you can produce those secure bits and bytes.
That tone from the top, consistency across the org, and giving people the tools to actually walk the walk, that's the key. Anyone can say some words in a blurb and this and that, but, being consistent about it in every venue and, saying like, hey, this is how we're going to do it. This is where the trade-offs are. And this is how I am empowering you to actually make the right choices. That's the part that has to be there throughout.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day that I think we hear that developers that they pride themselves on releasing quality software, but then there's do they equate that actual quality code with secure code? And so there's the question of in organizations, I think you can maybe go across the board and see some that do and some that don't, but I just love to get your take on that as well.
Well, I think secure code is quality code, right?
That's right.
So when you label something as a quality piece of code, you can label it you can have a look at that code in a couple of ways. Is it nice and clean? Is it efficient? And also, is it secure? So I think that's definitely one part of that. However, the reality is developers like to code, and you have an idea, you have a thing you want to bash out. You're in a very dynamic environment. You want to move super fast, so you grab your favorite programming book and you learn a language and you go ham and just build a thing. And it usually doesn't look the best, or it's not the best thing out there. And we live in this world of two pizza teams, of super high velocity decision making. But also, one of the things that has changed since, I think in the last 10 years or 15, is that developers now have to write secure and quality code, not because of the company, not because of security, it's because of them, because they have to maintain everything around it. So no longer will a security person get paged in the middle of the night because there's a zero-day exploit on a thing. No longer will a DevOps person have to reboot a server because something bad code. The developer itself is going to have to work on these things. So, you build it, you run it, and then, you try to build some high-quality code in it.
The interests, right? The shared responsibility.
Yeah. Shared responsibility, exactly.
Right. Working in some companies where, especially once a company gets past a certain size, like any reasonable size, security will be that matrix function where there's certain experts in a certain department, but they need to be propagating the tools and ways through the rest of the org, through departments that they don't really control, and, a lot of times in the messaging, when we would speak with them about, hey, we're not just telling you to do this to, for our own entertainment, this is for all of us. And if something happens that's negative, that is something that's going to follow all of us in our careers and in the company, in terms of that stain. So, think about it in that regard. And then there are ways to more positively align the interests as well. As Matthias was saying, that the interest part is very core. And what I saw in companies which were executing well on Matrix is that they would very logically line up the incentives for the developers. Hey, you get rewarded on the number of bugs you burn down. These are quality bugs and security bugs. And, that rate of burn down will impact, both your performance and your bonus goals. And so everything was very, very straight lined. There was no struggle or fighting over that. Everyone was on that same page.
And I just want to add one more thing here. We failed to mention the world of open source here. So when you are writing closed source software, only you and your peers look at it. If you're writing open source software, everybody scrutinizes it. So you as a developer have the aim, okay, I'm going to make my code nice because it needs to sit on GitHub and everybody's going to look at it. So there's also that aspect of it. I know when I have to write a sample for AWS and I want to put it on my GitHub page, I make explicitly sure that it's secure, that I'm not using like a blank IAM policy or whatnot. So because I know somebody else out there is going to look at it and they can call me out on it. So open source helps as well.
Yeah.
Got it.
Public reputation.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna switch here a little bit, and actually Darko inspired this as he showed us the book. So I want to ask Matthias the impact that you think that the language frameworks have on the security of the final product. Are there languages that are easier to secure than others?
Oh, they're all different. So they're all different, and to me, I think it is important for developers to be proficient in the language and framework that they're using on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, if they learn or if they program in Java EE, for example, well, it doesn't make sense to read up on how to secure C systems, or what to do with the C programming language or some high-level talk. And there definitely has to be a match between the programming language, essentially where it's used, and the potential vulnerabilities. Like if it's front end, then cross-site scripting makes sense to learn about that thing. If it's back end, and if it has a database, it makes sense to learn about SQL injection. If it doesn't have a database, you will not introduce something like SQL injection. So for me, languages and frameworks and the security on how to build secure systems in those languages and frameworks, it's super important to read up on those specifics. Is it harder or easier? Well, it's tricky. More frameworks, they introduce more default security features, and they're on by default. So quite often, like escaping for cross-site scripting, it's on by default, and you have to explicitly say, you know what, I do not want to do that because I have a very specific reason. So they're trying hard to make these frameworks more secure, and so that developers have an easier way. That being said, of course, if there's a problem in the framework, well, there's more insecure systems altogether. And it's not entirely the exact same thing, but if you look at the Log4j, for example, one, well, everybody is using that one, and we thought it was secure, and it turns out not to be, and now everybody is insecure. So if that happens in a language framework, it is the same kind of effect. It trickles down to everybody that is using that language and framework.
I like to use one thing here. Somebody said this a long time. I'm not sure where I read it, but somebody said, the best programming language is the one you're good at. So, saying that one language is more secure than the other one, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that, I don't know, language X is more secure than language Y, but ultimately, if you're really good at language Y, you can make it more secure by actually implementing some of the practices out there, right? So, it is really depending on how much you want to make effort to it. Of course, right? We're not talking about legacy languages, which are just vulnerable by themselves. We're just talking about mainstream languages and frameworks. And the more they use them, the more people want to make sure they're secure. And again, with the natural progression of open source software, people keep building tools and frameworks and add-ons to make said language even more secure.
Cool, thank you. Good point. Okay, so I'm going to switch to just talking a little bit more about DevSecops and the balance of security and a release velocity, because we get a lot of questions on that. So we always talk about the element is to shift security left or start left. So you have the developers prioritizing security across features and functionality. And the objection that we are seeing is from developers seeing security as a blocker. So we've talked a little bit about the building the trust, building things into OKRs, but it'd be great, Julie, just from your experience to talk about how organizations can approach a security program if they're just starting for their developers to ensure it doesn't seem like a blocker, and what works and what gets that adoption going.
Yeah, to start with, I'd start with trying to get the interests as aligned as possible, and again, that tone from the top, just so that people can start framing it a little bit differently. It's security is a necessity. Now, the question is, from a business point of view, how much are you going to put in and when? The expression I like to think of a lot is the idea of pay me now or pay me later, right? You're either going to be doing it all the while in the beginning, or you're going to layering it on later. And usually later is more costly because you need to go back and either refactor and reconsider things that you've now context switched away from. So I think getting to what's really effective, if you have really knowledgeable practitioners, or you can up level the training of your developers and infrastructure people, that's going to cut down your downstream impacts way more. Now, the hard part, of course, is the measurement part, right? It's much easier to measure incidents, cost of containment, cost of a vulnerability. All that stuff is very quantifiable. And the training piece starts to feel a little bit softer and amorphous. But the bottom line, honestly, is, if people are coding and building and administering securely from the beginning, the catch-up work or auditing later becomes much easier. One of the CISOs I'd worked with had said, look, if we're doing things securely, compliance is just a report. That's all. We didn't have to layer on a whole bunch of other stuff. And when I go into orgs and I see a delta between that, I say, okay, now I understand where we are in our life cycle in terms of, are we doing it after or are we doing it earlier? So, when you get into that whole arena of trying not to be a blocker, if you can't get people to understand and believe that we're really all on the same side, we're there for the customers and consumers and for the health of the company, start looking at it in terms of an efficiency and skill up leveling. Hey, this is a very marketable skill. Don't you want to learn? Don't you want to save yourself time in the long run? Don't you want to avoid having some catastrophic incident down the line? And I'll tell you, when people learn the hard way, they never forget. You get diehard security converts at that moment.
Exactly.
And then Darko, do you agree with that as far as the developers, the investing in the developers and getting them on board and kind of having that methodology?
So absolutely, you develop software, but also you need to develop people. So you need to basically enable your workforce, train them, give them the right tools and the knowledge to build secure software, right? So imagine a brand new developer coming to a brand new company. What is her biggest problem? She doesn't know what are the correct, guidelines. If she does something, is that bad or good? Is this not secure for this company's requirements? So having the tools, having the guidelines, I would not call them gates in place, but I would call them guardrails, right? Yeah, you can allow people to take steps left and right for the sake of experimentation because we want to try and we want to fail. But it gives you kind of guardrails, this is the secure way we do stuff. So, providing training, providing tools, and providing some guardrails to new developers to help them write the secure code.
Some paved path that you lay out.
Paved path, exactly.
Like that a lot.
Those are some good sound bites. I'm just like thinking about some great little sound bites and Twitter tweets right now. Great. So we're starting to see some questions coming in. So this is just a reminder for the panel to start to use the Q&A. But before we get to the audience questions, I want to probably talk about a couple more things. So Matthias, so we know that Secure Code Warrior, that they're doing a research study that's going to get released in April. And something that was cited was that there was the lack of time is the number one barrier to shifting security earlier in the development, the life cycle. So I would love to get your take on that. And then, so what do you say to the organizations who are really dependent on that tools versus the skills as that faster option to resolve the code security issue? So the ones that are saying, okay, I understand that there is a lack of time, but I need to solve problem X. So this tool is going to solve that problem X instead.
Lack of time is an interesting one, and it comes back to what Julie just mentioned. It's about convincing that proactive is better than reactive. And the best analogy that I can come up with is, if you build a house, you're either going to have a burglar alarm or not. And if you choose to take a burglar alarm, how do you know it paid off if it's never broken into? If your house is never broken into, did it work? Did it not work? Hard to say. If you do not get one and they come in, you should have gotten one. So it's a really tricky one. And again, best analogy that I can come up with, I hope they break into your neighbor's house so you need a burglar alarm. Okay. So if one of your competitors goes down, goes under, and is targeted, you quickly need to upskill, and you're lucky. You can consider yourself lucky. And that can help with the timing issue. So hey, you know what? Proactive it's in nature way harder to measure than reactive. So hopefully something happens where you can say, yeah, you know what? Like, we have to make sure that we do not get into trouble, that this is not our organization, and that we can prevent something like that. In terms of tools, so tools can do everything. Well, I think we've clearly shown that we cannot do it. I think SQL injection is 20 plus years old. I'm not sure how old the oldest static analysis solution company is. There's plenty more. There's RASP, there's EASP. By the way, don't get me wrong. You need this. You need these technologies to secure your code. But it has clearly shown that there was like 50% of the equation missing here, which is the people. We need the people as well to make sure that, first of all, these tools are optimized for what we need them to do. It doesn't make sense to just write code and then scan and say, oh, you have plenty of, preventable things that did make it into the code. So first of all, we need to upskill our workforce to make sure that simple stuff is not entering our code base, and that these tools, are really doing what they are meant to do, which is these hard to find problems where you need complex paths through your application or a combination of 2 or 3 things to actually lead to an exploit. So that simple stuff is not found by these expensive solutions. So to me, it is clearly shown in the last 20 years that we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve because we forgot this whole other area, which is the people that are building the systems.
Got it. Great. Thank you so much. So I have one last question for all of you. We'll do this popcorn style. Okay. For our listeners, the one thing that they should consider in the next few months to improve their software security. So just one thing. Darko, I'm going to start with you, Julie, and then Matthias.
Just one thing. I mean, do security. I know it's horrible. So when you build things, think about the scope of impact, right? So when you work on a piece of software, when you work on infrastructure, think about how a problem in that bit of infrastructure, in that bit of software, how far does the impact go if it's compromised? So this is where we get to talk about APIs and microservices and all these things. So try to reduce the scope of impact on code changes, on even when using a specific library. And this comes also with when you're using like multiple languages, right? If you want to write something very specific in some weird language because that's the skill you have, fine. But if it's a potentially unsecure language, reduce the scope of impact of that little piece of tool or software.
Awesome. Julie.
Yes. Yes, I would say that if obviously every company or situation is insecure in its own way. So if I were to give one piece of takeaway advice, is to know thyself, know yourself in terms of your vulnerabilities and your threats. Everyone has a slightly different profile in terms of who's coming after them and what are the weak spots in the org. Only you know where you actually have some defense in depth and where you don't. And every security org is constantly balancing constraints. So when you're making those trade-offs, really know where do you feel you could feel at peace with the choices you made based on what you know to be your weaknesses.
Got it. Thank you. And Matthias?
I'll take a slightly different path here because you asked specifically for developers. And I would say for a developer, think about your career and think about if you're going to move on to your next job, what will you bring to the table to differentiate yourself from the rest? How will you be able to prove that you can write good Java code? What does that even mean? You can write good code. Yeah. So think about that. And in light of that, I would say my best guess is if you can bring security to the table and talk about that aspect, I would assume you will be seen as a person with skill. And I actually can tell you why I think that. In the beginning, if you're a junior programmer, you make syntactical mistakes. Oh, there's a semicolon at the end of Java. I did not know. Stuff like that. You make simple mistakes. But over the time, you learn about, you can use different files and functions and all the good stuff. And you go to the architecture. And only at the end of the journey, you're like, oh, my God, they're misusing my software. And they're doing, there's these hidden features that have security implications. So it's only at the end of the journey when you're around the security, when you're around the developer, that you come to the conclusion, oh my God, they misused the stuff that I created. So I think if you think about your career and you go to your next opportunity, these are things that you can bring to the table, or you can say, look, I'm a well-rounded developer because I think about every aspect, not only quality, not only, proper development style and all those good stuff, but also, hey, I think about how people can misuse my software.
Got it. Thank you. So we have a couple questions from the audience. So the first is, do you think it is possible to define some measurable core security code indicators? So I'm going to open it up to any of you to answer
that. Go ahead, Julie.
I'll take a whack at it, and then you have to try. Number one, and one of the references that I really have loved over time is a paper that I think was Raf wrote for HP, where there was a series of, it looks like Dark is familiar with it too, a series of about 4 or 5 metrics. And I still think of them as very relevant. One of those things, of course, is coverage area. How much are you actually looking at? A lot of times people will try to index towards only the part they see. And it's like, okay, so it's great that 20% is high quality, but how about that other 80% that we're not even looking at? So like really, that's a place where you want to be really honest as an org. Like, how much are we actually really scrutinizing? Another component is, I think, very good for consolidating severity information along with volume, which is a weighted risk factor, weighted risk trend. So looking at like, okay, in terms of criticals, like this has a higher weight and highs have a lower weight. And it's basically a vulnerability metric, an aggregated vulnerability metric. And so if I am at the early part of a journey and trying to communicate this, I will start with those two and say like, okay, where are we on how much we know and how are we on the aggregate picture? You can start getting into more and more deeper, interesting things, such as, time to resolve certain issues. And that can be pulled into an SLA also. And also recurrence of certain defects. So rate of defect recurrence, how well are people pushing it upstream into either an automated template or recipe, or that the learning has been absorbed. I think that's actually an excellent metric. Or like in infrastructure world, are you actually updating your builds and your configurations in a way such that that set of vulns never shows up again? So I think there's definitely ones that you can pull out to start. No, Darko.
No, I'm echoing just that. One of the things I also said, like, especially because I don't think we mentioned this today, but in the world of the cloud, code infrastructure is code, right? You deploy infrastructure,
Yes.
you deploy everything through an API call. So one of the things you can measure is by using some specific audits for infrastructure security. I forget the name of these specific. Oh my god, I forgot. There's these specific like criteria you can run against your infrastructure and audit them using some tools, and basically you can measure how secure your specific piece of infrastructure is. Like, do you have any open policies for security? Do you have open ports? Do you have unsecure ACLs, etc., etc.? Those kind of things.
Excellent. Great discussion, great answers. I think we actually are at time, so we probably will have to do a webinar part 2 that we will be hosting again. This has been an amazing discussion on just talking about developer-driven security, holistic strategy, business alignment, and everything and the like. So I appreciate everyone's perspective. Thank you, the audience, for joining us today. And if there's other questions that we did not answer, we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you again, and thank you to the panel. All right.
Thanks, Junie.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'd like to thank Julie, Darko, Matthias, and Junie for taking the time to join our discussion and share their expertise with us. I'd like to remind our audience that today's session was recorded. Shortly, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. So we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift card winners. Our first winner is Phoenix P. Our second winner is Vadim S. Our third winner is Scott S. And our fourth winner is Nordia G. So keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't see that email, just check your spam folder. I'd like to extend our gratitude to Secure Code Warrior for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us for today's webinar. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey. And we hope to see you at an upcoming Tech Strong Learning webinar. This is Cody J. Brown signing off.